A and S. I imagine Ann Schmiesing as a middle schooler in Salem, Oregon, with her dog Kurt, walking through the woods before the sun has fully come up. I imagine her curiosity springing like new growth from the understory of the forest, her eye tuned to every detail. The setting of the sun coming in just 8 hours, but still so far away there is ample time for discovery. With her pockets full of bread and her pup at her side, she looks ahead to see a day full of possibilities.
Oh, yeah. So I think
I can't imagine Ann facing a challenge that she wasn't actually excited about. Ann is the author of The Brothers Grimm, a biography, which The New Yorker listed as one of the best books of 2025. Ann is an incredible scholar of German literature and a senior vice chancellor for strategic initiatives at CU Boulder. Anders, I am so excited for you to come with us and talk about fairy tale, myth-making, and the possibility of imagination. On the Ampersand, we call this bringing together of the impossible the alchemy of anding. Together, we'll hear stories of humans who imagine and create by colliding their interests. Rather than thinking of and as a simple conjunction in that conjunction-junction kind of way, we will hear stories of people who see and as a verb, a way to speak the beautiful when you intentionally let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. As St. Mary Oliver asks, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Oh, I love this question. When I'm mothering, creating, and collaborating, it reminds me to replace a singular idea of what I think I should become with a full sensory verb about experiencing. I'm Erika Randall. And this is Ann Schmiesing on the Ampersand.
I started out writing about 18th century German drama. I also did 19th century drama and theater history. So my background, my dissertation work, all that, it's not fairy tales and folklore.
It wasn't?
No, it was not. It was not. I got into fairy tales because a colleague of mine years ago, we were tasked by our department of looking at our curriculum and seeing, what are the courses that other German programs have that we don't have. And it was hey, we don't have a course on German fairy tales. And so, I was one of the ones who did kind of, some of the older stuff, right? 18th, 19th century. I also happened to have 2 young daughters at the time. So I kind of volunteered to develop this course, never thinking that I would get into writing about fairy tales. And to the point that, I actually have to admit, I think there was a part of me that was probably a little bit disdainful. Like, I was excited to do the course, but what is there really to write about?
So you thought maybe it was lower art. This is a little
I just didn't. Yeah, it wasn't the 18th century drama. All of that. And then so I started teaching the course, and I was blown away, just blown away. I mean, first, just the enthusiasm of my students, that they brought to the subject matter and everything that they, I think, coming from Disney and pop culture, then really delving into the tradition of German fairy tales and other fairy tale traditions. And then at the same time, incidentally, I was losing my hearing. So I was going deaf. That's right. So I was going deaf. And one day I was prepping for a class, and I was going to be teaching this tale in which there is this wicked stepmother who she hears all these noises that others can't hear, right? And it's kind of describing her descent into madness, if you will. But for me, I was losing my hearing, and I was having all of these bouts of tinnitus, roaring noises in my ears, all of that. And so for me, reading that passage, it really resonated as, I of course, saw in it something totally different. And then I started paging through in that moment, paging through the collection, realizing there's tale after tale after tale that depicts characters with disabilities, with deformities, with disease. And there's been so little written about this. And so that really became the impetus for my book on disability in the Grimm's fairy tales.
I did not know that. Did it feel at all like you were being cast in the role? You were a mother, you were a woman, you were an assistant professor at the time, or were you associate? Did it feel like a, were you resisting it all too? Because there's like this kind of maybe a hyper-feminization of storytelling or bedtime tale. Did it feel like lesser from a feminist perspective? Did you go in that space? And then when you started to crack it open, go, wait, this is actually the opposite. There's so much room to give trouble from a feminist lens and from a disability studies lens?
Yeah, I think there was a part of that.
Okay.
I mean, I was really excited to develop the course, so it wasn't something that I was thinking as, oh gosh, now I have to develop, this new course or anything like that. But, I think there was a part of that. And one thing that is just really important to name is so many of the canonical fairy tales that we teach, they are sexist, misogynistic. They are, have racist components, anti-Semitic, on and on and on. And it's really important not to sweep that over under the rug, but to address that head on. And as much as fairy tales have been so normative in their own way, they've also, throughout the history of the fairy tale, they've been a space to subvert those norms.
Yes.
And I think that's what's really powerful too, is how you make fairy tales your own through this process of interpretation, but also telling and retelling.
Yeah, so there we go into the both and, which we love the and here on the ampersand.
Yep.
And when I found fairy tales through a children's lit class in undergrad, and I found them as a scholarly portal. And it, for me, because there's so much fairy tale used in dance, to then be
of course.
Right, but it's an embodied experience.
Yeah.
So like the Sleeping Beauty, when she falls asleep in the ballet, then she gets up and dances her dream self, and that started to really influence my kind of reimagination. And how could we mess with fairy tales as a way, and how do we play with the happily ever after? And you talk about in your book that the Grimm brothers were not as interested in happily ever after.
So many of their fairy tales do end happily.
Yeah.
So first, some of the happily ever after that we have in fairy tales, I mean, we do have to look back at the time in which these are being told and retold. We have to look at, I'll take the example of the Brave Little Tailor, that fairy tale. So we have a tailor who, at the end, he ends up being king. He ends up marrying the king's daughter and becomes king himself. So, some of that, what to us might seem this normative, oh, of course, it has to end with this marriage, or it has to, if you also consider that part of it is, it's a time when socioeconomically it's very, very rigid. And this idea that you can break through, you can break free of that. But one thing I find really interesting about the Grimms is that at times, they'll append a little rhyme onto the end of their fairy tale.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That little bonus, ...
And one of my favorites is at the end of a tale called Hans My Hedgehog. And it's one of my favorite tales. Principally because it's this half human, half hedgehog boy. He's born that way. He's shunned by his family, and he ends up asking his father for bagpipes and for shoes for a rooster so he can ride his rooster out into the forest with his bagpipes. That tale, the Grimms actually added this rhyme at the end of that tale. It's something like, my tale is done, now go to Gustian's house, is what it translates as. But it rhymes in German. And what the Grimms said is when they were boys, there was a woman in the town that they lived in before their father died early on, and she used to end all of her tales with that rhyme. And the idea is like, now it's up to you to retell this tale, to go forward. They actually changed it themselves. They put the name Gustian in, and that was Wilhelm's daughter, Augusta. So they purposely put that, in as a little personal. But I think what I really like about that rhyme is by ending that tale that way, it's again signaling to us go and retell this. Yeah. And to keep fairy tales alive, we have to keep retelling them. Yeah. And they do change. Yeah. They're told, they're retold, and we can bring something new to it.
It is really exciting. Producer Tim and I were talking before the interview today about the 150th at CU and thinking about fairy tale and myth and how critical it is to look at our stories.
That's right.
And to have them be open enough that others could see themselves in them to tell their story moving forward. And I think as academics, but also as administrators who are looking at our dream for the university, the dream for academia, the dream for education, how do we put those golden keys in the hand, not knowing what doors they may open?
That's right. And I look at the 150th celebrations, and for me, I do approach this through a fairy tale folklore lens in the sense that, so for the Grimms, they really saw their collecting of fairy tales, of legends, of various folk texts. They saw this as a process of exhumation, of exhuming these long buried treasures that have been forgotten, and making sure that they don't die out, making sure that they're told, that they are retold. And so I see something similar in how we tell our story, right? I mean, humans, we gravitate towards storytelling because we want to make sense of our experience. We want to make sense of this thing we call life. We want to make sense of the world around us, and often we're doing that through storytelling. What I think is important is that there's no one story.
There's never one story.
Right. Yeah. There's always another story. There's always another perspective. There's always another way of telling the same basic story. What I really like about the 150th celebrations is this participatory aspect, this call for tell your story. Let us know about buffs that maybe have been forgotten. And this is everything from things we should be celebrating to things that we should have done better or could do better. Exactly. And so I see in that, again, this same pattern that I see in fairy tales and folklore, this notion that, we're never done. We're always retelling. We're always reshaping.
Oh, I love it. If you were headed into the dark wood, what would you bring with you?
So you can bring absolutely anything. And that's what is so wonderful about fairy tales, because what we often see, it's not so much what you bring, it's what you do with it. So we often see in the Grimm's tales, we'll see maybe a third-born son. And the two older brothers, they're given something that seems far more valuable, far more useful. And the third-born son is given something that just seems like, well, what in the world would you do with this, right? But that's the son who prevails because he knows how to use it.
Yes. Can you give us an example of like what's something that felt like maybe like meh?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to the tale I was talking about, Hans My Hedgehog, where he brings. I mentioned that his father is going to go into town and buy something and asks Hans My Hedgehog, what he should buy for Hans My Hedgehog. And he says the bagpipes. He wants bagpipes, right? And so when he rides off into the forest and his family's happy that he's leaving, right? Because they've shunned him. It's his playing of the bagpipes that eventually in the forest attracts these two separate kings and, through a bunch of plot twists and turns, helps to bring about this happy end. So we would think bagpipes, like, okay, we've got this half human, half hedgehog character riding a rooster playing bagpipes. I mean, you know, how imaginative, right? Yes. But you wouldn't think that that's going to end up being a useful tool, but it does. So it's how you approach what you're given, how you think with curiosity, with imagination, because the characters who don't know how to use the tools, it can be the most wonderful tool. It can be somebody who you would think they're wanting to help you, but if they don't know what to do with it, if they misuse it, it's not going to get them anywhere. So I think that's so powerful. And it also reminds us that in fairy tales, we might think that the magic is always external. but it's not. It's internal too.
Yeah.
And I think there is this aspect of the Grimm's fairy tales where we are the magic. We help to bring that about. It's not just some character who is giving that to us. And often it's how we band together with other characters.
It's the ruby slippers.
How we overcome adversity. Then I'll just say to you, the forest itself. For the Grimms, they grew up in this idyllic setting, rural setting, and because their father dies when they're relatively young, their socioeconomic standing really declined, overnight. Yeah. And the forest is this space of liberation in a way. It's this enchanted place where, really good but also really bad things can happen. But it doesn't matter what your socioeconomic background is. It doesn't matter if your family has told you that you're good for nothing and you'll never amount to anything.
You go into the woods?
None of that matters.
Yeah. You go into the woods.
So take anything you want into the woods with you, but just be open to how you might end up using it in a totally different way.
How does that serve you as an administrator? I heard you give a talk to a leadership group about going into the woods. And I think about this idea of being given a gift that you don't know is actually going to be the thing, that with your own magic, you alchemize into transformative properties. I want to know for you, what was a gift that you've been given that you didn't know was a gift? You didn't recognize it at first. And then if you could talk about a little bit about, just even in a paraphrase, the way that you talked about going into the woods as leaders, particularly in academia, but just as, what is it to go into the woods?
The thing about going into the forest is I think that any project, any problem, anything we're working on, to me, it almost always involves this aspect of going into the forest, because we might think that something's really clear from the outset. Okay, this is what we're going to do, or this is the. But as you start to unpack that, as you discover, oh no, there are these additional dimensions we didn't consider, or roadblocks, or it requires that you are able to go on that journey and not see it as a negative thing. Yeah. To realize that when you have obstacles, or it's something to listen to and to embrace and realize this is a normal part of the process. And also it's an important part of the process because it might actually help me to consider other perspectives that I wasn't listening to or just didn't even realize might come up. And I think for teams of people working, whether it's in administration or anywhere else, to be able to kind of struggle through that together and have the experience of, we were able to get through that.
Yes.
And we can do this again.
Yeah. And how do you trust, like, who has the lantern, but who has the match? That's and right. Then who has the bagpipes?
That's right.
That's right. And to trust that all those things are valuable.
And I think it also has taught me it's something that we talk about, but also really experiencing it directly, how critical it is to have the diversity of perspectives, the diversity of experiences on those teams. And there are fairy tales where you have a group of what other characters might view as, oh, well, that's a group of misfits. How are they possibly going to be successful in revolting against the king or something like that? But they are, because those very qualities that other people would view as, they're misfits, or they're even freakish characters or something like that, they are able to draw on precisely those discounted qualities to arrive at the solution at the end. And I think that's such a good reminder to all of us.
Yeah, that's so exciting. In your process, you do look for breadcrumbs. You are a detail-oriented person. Your writing is magical in the way that you bring details to life. It really feels like you are somehow getting in a time machine, going into the room where a thing happened. And I'm like, how do you know all of this? How do you know what color the sheep were because of the color of the stockings? Because this Jacob didn't like to get mud on white. How do you know? How do you know that Jacob got out of his bed and stared at the night sky? And how do you know about the beards on the wallpaper? Have you been in those rooms? It just made me think about you as I was reading about them. How does your process work? What does it look like? You're a translator and you're a historian and you're a beautiful writer and you're so curious.
So first, one thing I should say is that the Grimms themselves loved details.
Yes.
Loved details. And they were aware that they loved details to a fault sometimes. I mean, Jakob Grimm would write to friends, I totally get it that this work on linguistics or this work, I know it's chock full of details. I just can't resist. I mean, but he knows. So drawn to detail, and I kind of wanted to capture that as well.
So you're mirroring some of that
in a way, I think. Okay. Yes,
but some of it's you,
and certainly it resonates with me because I too, like them, I'm fascinated by how details that we might assume are just, incidental to something else actually are key in understanding our own personalities, identities, worldviews, whatever it might be. So when I went and did various research trips to Germany while I was writing the biography, it was really important to me to go to the places where they lived, however changed, obviously.
Are many of them held as they were? So much time had passed before they really became the famous duo that we know today that, of course, they've changed?
So you can go to the house that they lived in a small village, Steinau. It's a Brothers Grimm Museum right now. So the interior is a lot different from what it would have been. But, in terms of the exterior, you can go to the house, you can walk the streets, that they would have walked. You can go to the church where their ancestor, was pastor, things like that.
Is that the church who was buried under the floorboards?
That's right.
That was an amazing moment thinking about under the pulpit or under the...
That's right.
Wow.
Yep, that's right. So it was important to me to go and see those places, also to go and see even the mementos that they had on their desks, see their mahogany desks.
What was on their desks? Because I want to know what's on your writing desk, but what it was on, I want to know those two things, but what was on their desk?
So they had a variety of things on their desks. So it was, anything from, they had things from nature, like pine cones, petrified piece of wood, to little statuettes, to, all sorts of
kind of what you would
things.
Imagine, because objects are so critical in this work.
Yes. Yeah. So lots of different objects that they had, in addition to seeing their really big inkwells and, all of that. And then...
That's wild to think about, the pool of ink where they drew forth
exactly
their words.
Exactly. And then seeing this, all the slips of paper on which they, made notations, or the handwritten, they were really big in their personal copies of their various works they're just covered with...
Could you see the dictionary?
Covered with marginalia. Yeah.
The marginalia is just exquisite.
So things like that, those details, for me, they're not abstractions. They were real people. Yeah. And I think it's things like that really help bring them to life.
Yeah. And so you have been speaking German for a long time. What brought you to that language? I'm looking at your last name and I'm wondering. But can you talk to me about that? And then the interesting thing to me is, as a translator of texts, you have choice that you're making. And I was reading about them making choice. And at one point they talked about using EI instead of AI for grain because they felt bad for EI being used less often. I was like, oh my God, I love that you're imbuing a pairing of letters and prioritizing it, because you know what? It doesn't get as much action. Yeah. So let's just bring... So I want to... I love that stuff. So for you, how did you get into German with such a passion? And then how, as a translator, do you make choice?
So I got into German when I was in elementary school. I was kind of bored in school.
Were you in Oregon growing up?
I'm sorry?
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Southern Oregon.
Southern Oregon, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was a little bit bored in school, and...
Because you're a genius.
No, because I was just...
In the margins, it says, because she's a genius. Keep going.
And so my father had taken German in college, and I found his college textbooks on the shelf, and I started paging through them, and I thought, oh, this is really cool. I want to learn German. So told my parents, oh, I'd really love to learn German. And it turns out that there was a German woman in our neighborhood just a couple blocks away. And so she started teaching me German. I would go over to her house after school a couple times a week. Within a year of my learning German with her, she said, oh, I want to take you to Germany for the summer, because she had a niece who was around my same age, which was a great experience because it was just all German all the time, immersion. So that really helped. Immersion. But I never had it in high school or anything like that. I did major in German and English as an undergrad. And I still remember the first fairy tale I ever read in German, because it was in one of the books that she had when she was teaching me German, and it was this fairy tale called How Six Made Their Way in the World, and it's one of the ones where you do have that band of what others would view as misfits,
and you loved
who band together, and so I still remember reading that tale.
When you started thinking with disability studies and with fairy tale, and you had seen that there was a gap in that space, did it feel also in your book you talk about the silver lining theory? From my memory, it comes from when Jakob is giving his speech about old age and the benefit that when you lose one thing, you gain another. And I love the way you kind of, again, both and give a little trouble to that idea. It sounds like you came to your own understanding of disability studies sooner, and not just through that kind of premise or intention or in conversation with that premise, but from seeing these different characters who have a really strong part and a strong pool. And even though some of them might become the bad guys,
right,
they are, at least their stories are told and their stories are there. So I'm thinking with disability studies, and was it a counter to this kind of silver lining theory, or was it, or in partnership with, or tell me how their work, Grimm's work, fairy tales, got you to ask these really interesting questions that help reveal totally new ways of thinking about old stories.
So they definitely had this compensatory model of disability where, all right, I mean, Jakob at the time that he delivers that lecture is losing his hearing. So, nature surely must compensate. I mean, there surely must be. and you see that in some of the fairy tales too. What in disability studies we refer to as the super cripple or super crip depiction, where it's not only that a character is portrayed as being able to compensate for a disability, but to compensate in some sort of superhuman way. So the problem with this is that if you have this mindset that people with disabilities can always compensate, and even in these superhuman ways, then you might feel that they don't need accommodations. They don't need, things like that. So that's, and I don't want to suggest at all that people with disabilities never compensate. I compensate. I have no natural biological hearing left. I hear with cochlear implants, which is electric hearing, and I rely far more on lip reading than probably, most other people do. Yeah. So I would never want to suggest that there's none of that. But this idea that, it's this silver lining really has to be
questioned.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, in other respects, what I can say is we do have a lot of Grimm fairy tales where the character with a disability or a deformity who has been marginalized by society does end up prevailing in the end.
They do.
Now, so
society kind of pushing them out, and they make their way through the woods.
Sometimes, though, at the point that they're prevailing, their disability is also magically removed. And that, too, then being problematic because suggesting that, the only happy end you can have is if suddenly that goes away. And then the other thing, too, is in many of their tales, and we see this throughout world literature, you have portrayals of people with disabilities, and the disability is used as a marker of, the evil character or something like that. And in some cases, the Grimms themselves intensified that. So they're making changes to the tales where they intensify that deformity or something like that. So yes, a lot of nuances. The other thing is too, Wilhelm Grimm, he had severe illness on and off throughout his life, a heart ailment and things like that. So he often as he's writing about how he edits fairy tales, he's using these very images of disease and healing and things like that.
You talk about the cell phone in the knapsack and how it could feel like the most useful tool, but without battery, it's just a dead brick. And it's like the gold, the Midas touch that also happens a lot in the Grimm tales where, we to get the gold, but you can't eat gold and you can't make a warm blanket from gold.
That's right.
Can you talk more about this idea of the most precious thing actually being a complete and total pain in the ass in some of these fairy tales, that sometimes getting stuck with a golden egg is not what you want for breakfast?
Yeah. And I think depending on the tale, you can find a lot of different answers to that question. I mean, there is one tale in the collection where the protagonist, he keeps bartering away everything he had, and every exchange he makes, it's something that we would think is of lesser value, till at the end, I mean, he's basically left with next to nothing and runs away really happy. And so you can interpret that a couple ways. Is he this really foolish character who's just making all these stupid exchanges? Yeah. Or is the point that there is something to this, and we're too attached to these particular items, whatever it might be. So I think you can see in a variety of different ways with regard to the Midas touch and things like that. The Grimms are using that idea when they're talking about how they are actually editing their tales, because they collected tales and then they edited them, and they were challenged at first after their first edition. There was a lot of criticism because it was like, well, you should have polished these up more. I mean, come on. Oh yeah,
I remember you writing about that. Yep.
Yeah, like what is this and all of that. And yes, they did for the second and subsequent editions. They engaged in more editing and things like that. But their central point is, well, we're not out here to write our own fairy tales from scratch. We want to preserve these. Yes, we're making some edits here and there, but if we radically remake them, they're going to become sterile. We're going to kill off the thing that is enlivening them. We're going to kill off, and we don't want to do that. And so how you navigate, what is the degree of shaping, reshaping? How do you keep that alive? How do you keep that organic? And they're using a lot of organic metaphors too. So that, and they're not always true to their espoused philosophy, but they're also living at a time when folklore is new. Yes. I mean, the very word folklore in the English language didn't come about until the 1840s, and it was coined by a British scholar who coined it with direct reference to the Grimms, saying, we need a James Grimm, he said, to do for the British Isles what Jakob Grimm has done for Germany. So there weren't these established scientific norms. There weren't, so sometimes it's easy for us to look back and blame the Grimms or blame, this isn't the standards that we would have today. But they at least would say, look, yes, okay, we edited these. We're trying to do some reshaping. Sometimes what they collected was a fragment, and they would try to merge it with another telling to make it whole, something like that. But the idea that you don't want to do something so radical that you're killing it off, that you're making it,
you lose the spirit.
This gold that we can't, it's not going to nourish us.
So that brings me back to the question about you as a translator. Do you think with that kind of principle of gold, not over polishing, not over reading into it, or how do you hold that as someone who understands the language and sees that there are so many different ways to hold the language, depending on where you are in history, where you are geographically, all of it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there were, in the biography, just even making determinations of how am I going to even refer to the place that they grew up.
Yes.
I mean,
I remember this part. There were like 4 different ways you could say what are all the ways? That's
right. So they grew up in what in German we call Hessen-Kassel, and in English, Hessen is often referred to as Hesse. You can spell Kassel with a K or a C. You can, all of these things. So even decisions like that, how do you do that?
Because it sets a tone then for how you make choices going forward.
Exactly.
If you use this because you're going to stick with this.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I noted Jakob talking about, this word for grain and whether you should spell it AI or EI.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was lovely. It's like, well, you can do either one, but I like the AI because there's so little of that in
so
German.
It was the AI. I got it backwards. But he fell in love with the AI.
Yeah. And so I think it just kind of reminds us, we're always going to have these questions when we translate, or questions about orthography or things like that.
And it also, I loved where you went in and talking about, I think it was, I'm going to say Jakob now, not Jacob, because I hear you saying it.
That's great.
I'm going to go Jakob. But talking about how women were often better storytellers.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that. That was exciting because we're hearing so many of these folk tales from men's voices.
That's right.
And yet they pointed to the fact that women, because they didn't maybe have such an academic understanding of the language, that they stayed more in the vernacular of the time or the land.
It's their view. That was indeed their view. And in fact, when they're telling people to go out and, help them with collecting, it's often what they are giving as instructions. Try to find women or at least try to find children, try to find people who are not going to be tainted, so to speak. Yeah. But at the same time, they know they're already living in a time when fairy tales are looked down on. I mean, and that to some extent you can see that for centuries. It's not just new to the Grimm's time, but they realize that some of the storytellers are going to be reticent to tell their tales because it's looked down on as you're telling fairy tales, and so that becomes a challenge for them as well. And they know too that this tradition of oral storytelling is waning, and so that's part of the reason why they really want to collect the tales before they die out.
They're gone.
Yeah, and so there is that palpable sense of loss.
Yes.
And they're
urgency and
loss. They're living at a time of so many upheavals. They're living through the Napoleonic Wars. I mentioned in the book too that one of the tales, the person who told it to a friend of theirs, he died in battle a few days later. So had that not been told,
gone.
Exactly. And so that's really for them, there is that sense of urgency. But I think it's also for me, when I was researching them and writing the book, just seeing they lived in a very, very different time from our own, needless to say. And yet there's so many aspects of the times through which they lived that to me resonate with our own time.
Yes. And we're getting close to the end. And I don't know if we want to ... or happily ever after the ending of this interview. I know we're going to end with a game called the Quick and Dirty, so I'm going to make you compete, and because you know about that game. But before we go there, I'm wondering if you could just share with me what keys the Grimm brothers have put into your hands.
Yeah. And, I'll say the last fairy tale in their collection. There's some legends appended to it, but the last tale through all 7 complete editions of their collection is The Golden Key, and it's just one paragraph long, and it's about this boy, and he's sent out. It's snowy and cold, and he's sent out to gather wood, and he wants to build himself a fire because it's so cold. He's digging through the snow. He finds this key. Oh, well, it must fit a lock. And, digs further, finds this chest. And he opens the chest, the casket. And, of course, we're expecting, there's going to be a genie, or there's going to be riches, or there's going to be what's going to happen. This is where the fairy tale really starts to begin. And instead, the narrator just says, okay, we'll have to find out what he found. And that the Grimms ended their collection with that, right? They didn't start it. If they would have had that be the first one, you'd think, all the 200 plus tales to come, that's what he found, right? That's symbolically. But they end it with that. And I think that's so powerful because it's saying this isn't the be all and end all. There's still so much to discover. There's so much. And to me, that I think of that tale so often because it's something for me we're going to find things that we never thought we would. And we might search for certain keys. Maybe we'll find some of them, maybe we won't. And that space of creativity, of imagination, fairy tales have put, into my hands at least, this notion that there are alternatives to the status quo. And we should imagine what those might be. And it's not change for change's sake. It's how can we always make things better? And that's this idea, too, that there's always another retelling. We can always retell. We can always iterate. A decision that I might make at a certain point of time, that might be the best decision for that point in time, but time doesn't stand still. And so maybe later on, we need to rethink this. We need to improve on this. And I think for me as an administrator, for me as a scholar, for me in my personal life, whatever it might be, I think that's just a really powerful key in and of itself.
Amazing. Okay. Now we're going to play the quick and dirty.
Okay.
After, right. I could just end there, but just mic drop. But this is too much fun, and I haven't gotten to do it in a while. So, quick and dirty for our listeners, and I think you know this game, and is you get to answer as fast as you can. Okay. And it doesn't have to be dirty, but it's got to be quick. And you can say "and" between your answers, or I could ask you a question about objects you'd want to find on a quest, and you could say a handkerchief, or the hand knit sweater that you would make, because we know you're a fabulous knitter. Okay, so or you could just say a sweater and So there's ways in. Are you ready to play?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think yes. Let's do it.
Okay, so we're gonna go back to the question about things on your desktop. What are the objects on your writing desk?
I have a bust of Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm that was given to me. Yes, I do. Yes, and I have some other Grimm editions and things like that. So you're definitely going to find fairy tale objects on my desk.
I love that. That's amazing. Yes. If you could collect things from any of the stories, if you could have any of the magical or maybe seemingly not magical, but objects from the tales, if you could have them, hold them, what would those magical objects or fairy tale story objects be? What would you love to touch and hold?
Okay. Oh, I love this question. I definitely want something from the spinning tales, because I myself do a lot of textile arts. So I definitely want some of that flax or some of that, right? That whatever it is that's spun into gold. I want some of that. I would love that. Yeah. I'm not musically inclined myself, unfortunately, but I would love those bagpipes. I mean, how cool is that? Bagpipes. I mean, seriously.
And imagine how tiny they are.
Oh my gosh, exactly, right? For this half human, half hedgehog. Yes. Gotta have the bagpipes. Yes. Yeah, so those are a couple of the things. Yeah. Definitely.
So many good objects. I'm obsessed with the objects. What are some of the things from your childhood when you walking in Oregon that you would have collected out in your wood?
Oh gosh, I spent a lot of time walking in the woods in Oregon. I was growing up with my dog, and for many years, I would actually have, how people have recurring dreams? Yes. I would have a recurring dream of walking in the forest in Oregon with my dog. So, yeah. And so the things that I would collect in the forest, berries, mushrooms, sticks, moss, whatever. Yeah.
And you would go out and your dog would sniff, and you would get into the understory of the woods with your pup. Right. What was your pup's name?
His name was Kurt.
Yeah. That's the best. Yeah. That's the best. Okay, you talk about your band of six.
Yeah.
Can you just give us that litany of the band of six? You can say names, or you can say this grad professor. Just list them off. Who's your band of six that you want with you? Or even now, who's your band of six that you want going into the woods to solve a problem?
So band of six, let me name a few people. So the person who taught me German, definitely.
What's her name?
Her name was Ilse.
Ilse.
Yeah. So my dissertation supervisor, Barry. There are a few of my icons in fairy tale studies.
Who are those? I want to know.
Don Haase, Jack Zipes, Maria Tatar, and there are many others. But I'm so grateful, to them. And then, honestly, I would put in that band of 6. I want somebody from the younger generation of scholars, because I am so jazzed when I see some of the work that, the generations now coming up, right? Because that's so important that we are there, and I want to pay it forward. People were there for me in my career, and it's super important that that we pay it forward, and we're there, and we the legacy that we leave.
Yes.
Is super important, right? Because we're not going to be here forever, and making sure that that our discipline can survive and thrive, and we're creating an environment where young scholars can bring their own interpretations of fairy tales or whatever it might be. So yeah, I would want somebody like that along on the journey that I can learn from in new ways.
I love that. That takes us to our last, where we have done in the past on other seasons, kind of a blessing that we would give, like you were giving a graduation speech. Yeah. We're wondering, what is, thinking more like a wish you have for future generations, whether it's of students or of just the planet right now, with all the discord that we're feeling all over the world. What would be your wish that you have for all of us?
Well, I would repeat something I think that I said maybe a few minutes ago, that I really believe we are all the magic. And, people should never think that I don't have agency, I can't do anything about whatever the problem is. We can, and we are that, and we have it in ourselves to affect meaningful change.
And that was Ann Schmiesing, Senior Vice Chancellor for Strategic Initiatives and Professor of German at CU Boulder. For more on Ann and her research, see our show notes. The Ampersand is a production of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is written and produced by me, Erika Randall, and Tim Grassley. If there are people you'd like us to interview on the Ampersand, do please email us at asinfo@colorado.edu. Our theme music was composed and performed by Nelson Walker, and the episodes are recorded at Interplay Recording in Boulder, Colorado. I'm Erika Randall, and this is the Ampersand.